Hello everybody, and welcome to a Kaldheim draft guide. In this video, I'm going to be helping you get ready for your first Kaldheim drafts. But before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment in the comment section down below with your questions or feedback. Without further ado, let's dive on in. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the set mechanics. I'm going to be going over the top 3 commons by color. I'm going to be covering archetype overviews, I'm going to look at the combat tricks, and then I'm going to talk about traps, combos, and more. So starting things off with the set mechanics. In the set, modal double-faced cards are here. Foretell is a new mechanic, Boast is a new mechanic, Snow is a returning mechanic, and then Vehicles are a returning mechanic, Sagas are a returning mechanic, and Changelings are a returning mechanic. So there are a lot of mechanics in this set, but a lot of them are returning, so hopefully some of those are going to be familiar. Starting things off with modal double-faced cards. Luckily for the complexity of the set, these only appear at Rare and Mythic, and basically they are cards that on the front side do one thing and on the back side they do the other. So you can cast them for either half of the card, and once you've cast it for that, it is going to stay that way for its duration of being in play, though sometimes if it gets returned to your hand, you can then cast the other half of the card. Pretty straightforward. Next is Foretell. Foretell is a pretty cool cost reduction sometimes and cost spreading out mechanic in other times. So the way it works is you foretell the card from your hand instead of casting it normally, and to do that you put it into the exile zone face down and pay 2 colorless mana. Or 2 generic mana, as it were. And then later on in the game, you can cast it for its foretell cost, which is indicated on the card. You can't cast it on the exact same turn, so you can't put it into exile and cast it on that same turn, but you can do it any turn after that. So if you have an instant, like Depart the Realm, you can put it face down on your turn and then cast it for a single blue on your opponent's turn, or you can put it face down on your turn and then cast it again on your following turn, as the case would be with like a sorcery or something of that nature. Next up is the Boast mechanic. It is a attacking based mechanic where after you have attacked with a creature, you have the ability to activate its Boast ability. This ability is able to be used for the rest of the turn while the creature's still around, so you don't have to use the Boast ability, and you don't have to use it especially immediately. So with the example of Teskari Firewalker, if you're attacking your opponent, maybe they have a blocker and you have a combat trick, you can elect not to use its Boast mechanic right away, and then if your opponent does block, you can use your combat trick to win the combat, and if they don't block, then you can activate the Boast ability and then have your mana up to spend on whatever card you end up exiling. So there's a lot of flexibility with Boast, but what it does entail is you have to be attacking to use it, and you can only use it once per turn. Keep that in mind. Okay, next is a returning mechanic, Snow. Basically, Snow is a mechanic that rewards you for having other cards that say Snow on them. So in the set, there are snow-covered islands instead of normal basics in the pack. There is also a cycle of snow-covered dual lands. And the way that works is instead of a basic land slot, you're getting access to these snow lands, and you have to draft them as you would draft normal cards within a set. So you don't just get to go to your land station, put a bunch of snow in your deck. You have to draft the cards themselves. But there are also snow payoffs in the set. So if you have a card like Avalanche Caller and you have some snowlands in your deck, all of a sudden you have the ability to start making 4/4 elemental creatures with hexproof on a temporary basis, which is pretty nice. So you can't just put the snowlands into your deck. Keep that in mind when evaluating them. But if you do have enough snow islands or snow dual lands or whatever type of snowland you're going for, you can sometimes build some really sweet snow decks. Next up is Vehicles. This is a pretty straightforward mechanic. A vehicle is basically a creature that's not a creature unless it's crewed. So with the example of Funeral Longboat, it's got a crew cost of 1, which means that you have to tap a creature with total power 1 or more, or any number of creatures. So you can tap excess creatures if you have a higher crew cost. So if there was crew 3, you could tap any number of creatures with total power 3 or more, and then all of a sudden your Funeral Longboat becomes a creature until the end of the turn. So pretty straightforward stuff with regards to vehicles. There are a couple of those in the set. Next is Sagas. Sagas is a very thematic mechanic and also a pretty straightforward one. They are built around lore counters, so when they enter play, they enter with a lore counter, and then every upkeep after every turn after your draw step, so not the upkeep, after your draw step, you get an extra lore counter on them. So with the example of Invasion of the Giants, you play it, immediately get the counter, so you scry 2. Next turn, after your draw step, you then put a second lore counter on it, and you trigger the second effect, and then after your third draw step, you trigger the third effect, and then you sacrifice the Saga. So they're relatively straightforward, but they can be confusing the first time you look at them, or a little bit overwhelming, but they're not actually that complicated once you've started getting to play with them. And then finally, there is the changeling mechanic. There are changelings are cards that count as every creature type. There are some tribal synergies within the set, so changelings can really like glue your deck together in that way, and they can also just queue off of being just a normal creature type. Sometimes there are cards that might care about your creature being a giant or being a berserker or an elf, and changelings really just work well with all of those mechanics and can be nice little tools in your deck, but they're also just solid creatures in their own right a lot of the time as well. So that's the final mechanic in the set. Moving on to the top commons, we're going to be starting things off with white. The number 1 common is Bound in Gold. Just efficient white enchantment-based removal is generally going to be pretty strong, and this is no exception. Number 2 is Code Spell Cleric. This card is going to be really nice in your more aggressive white decks, which most white color combinations end up being on the more aggressive side, because when you're double spelling with your Code Spell Cleric and getting 2/2 worth of stats for only 1 mana, that's going to be quite powerful. And then finally, Stalwart Valkyrie gets the number 3 slot. When you are able to cast this for 2 mana early in the game, it can be quite powerful. You can just imagine the classic sequence of 2-drop, trade it off, and then on turn 3, you play your Stalwart Valkyrie for only 2 mana and follow it up with a Code Spell Cleric, and then you have a really intimidating board really early in the game. So Stalwart Valkyrie is just going to be a pretty solid card in your white decks. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Behold the Multiverse. Just a really nice way to get some card advantage in your blue decks. It just gives you a lot of selection and draws you 2 cards, and being able to split up its cost using Foretell is quite powerful as well. At number 2 is Augury Raven. There are some decks that are going to want Augury Raven more than Behold because they care more about the creature than about the card draw, but Augury Raven is going to be starting off at number 2. It's just a really efficient creature. 4 mana, 3/3 flyer would already be pretty good, and then adding Foretell is a nice power boost as well. And then finally, at number 3 is Karfil Harbinger. This is a really nice effect because blue doesn't typically get mana ramp, and so having the ability to play a nice defensive creature that can then help you cast your Behold the Multiverses or foretelling abilities is really nice as well. So Karfil Harbinger is going to be a nice card for the blue decks, especially the more controlling ones. Moving on to black, at number 1 is Feed the Serpent. Just a very efficient removal spell. Kills anything you need to get killed for 4 mana, which is generally just a good rate in limited. It might not sound that efficient, but it actually ends up playing out really nice because a lot of the time they're just cards that you have to kill. Exile is also a nice bit of upside. At number 2 is Infernal Pet. If you're a more aggressive black deck, this has a lot of potential. The ability to hit for 3 or even 4 damage in the air during the mid stages of the game is really nice, and the fact that the counters are permanent is really a nice addition to this card. And then finally is Way Down. Way Down is held back a little bit by the creature clause on the card. The fact that you have to have a creature in your graveyard to use it means that you can't always use it to take out your opponent's 2-drop or something of that nature in the matchups where you really need to kill their early creatures. But all you have to do is trade off 1 creature, have a couple of defensive plays, and then all of a sudden Way Down becomes very efficient. So that gets the number 3 slot. Moving on to red. Red gets a suite of removal spells at its top 3 commons, starting off with Demon Bolt, which is fantastic. 3 mana to deal 4 is already a pretty good rate, and the ability of having Foretell for just a single red mana after you've foretelled it is quite nice. Frostbite is number 2. Just a really cheap interactive spell once again, and if you have some extra snow lying around or a couple of snow mountains, then the ability to do 3 is really a significant amount of upside. And then finally, Squash gets the number 3 slot. It's not going to be as hard to get a giant as it might sound because there are changelings in the set, and Squash is one of the biggest benefactors of that. Any deck that has a couple changelings are going to love having Squash, and it's not even that bad if you have to pay a full price for a deal 6. Finally, moving on to green, at number 1 is Serulf's Packmate. Just having a 3/3 body that replaces itself is really good, and Foretell means that you're usually going to be able to cast this card in the early stages of the game, or going to be able to help yourself have more efficient turns if you are struggling to hit your land drops or something like that. Next is Struggle for Skemfar, which again really benefits from Foretell and is just a good effect on its own. Green oftentimes has large creatures, so putting a counter on one of them and then fighting something is usually going to take care of the threat that you want to take care of. And then at number 3 is Masked Vandal. You don't want to go overboard with the number of Masked Vandals you have, but getting the first copy is really nice because there is a minor equipment theme in the set. There are sagas that you can blow up, and there are enchantment removal spells running around like Bound in Gold that we saw in white. So Masked Vandal just has a lot of utility in those situations, and therefore is a card that you'll want to prioritize getting the first copy of. Okay, looking at some color rankings now. At number 1 is red, just because it's got such good removal spells across the board, taking care of a variety of threats, and it has good creatures with solid converted mana cost, so like a good curve of creatures, lots of good 2-drops and 3-drops and things like that. Blue is in second place. It's got a lot of powerful commons even after the 3 that I showed. Just a nice good controlling color, and there are even some good flyers and things like that, like the Augury Raven, to help you if you want to be a more aggressive blue deck, though typically blue will be playing a control role. At 3 is green. Green just has some really strong commons as well. Sorrel's Packmate, the Struggle for Skemfar, and just some changeling synergies can also help green tied together tied together well with some of the other colors. Black has some good removal spells, and it has some decent creatures, but it does have a little bit weaker card quality. And then white, just a lot of the cards in white are a little bit more situational. Some of them are much better in aggressive decks, some are much better in controlling decks. So it's not that their white color is bad, it's just you want to know what sort of white deck you're going to be drafting, because if you start taking the controlling cards and then find yourself in an aggressive deck, your white cards aren't going to be pulling their weight as much. That being said, the colors are all fairly close. There's not any one color that's significantly better or significantly worse, so this shouldn't inform your picks too much. Moving on to some archetype overviews, starting off with red-white. Its signpost gold card is Cole the Forge Master, which might indicate that you want to be playing equipments or auras in your deck, but white also plays a very good tokens and go wide strategy, using cards like Doomscar Titan to reward you for going wide, and Usher of the Fallen to make yourself a wide board. So red-white can play an auras or equipment theme if you do get a Cole the Forge Master, but otherwise you can just play a typical aggressive game plan and sometimes even have go wide synergies as well. Moving on to blue-black, it is mostly just going to be a typical control deck. If you do get heavy snow, then Narfi Betrayer King becomes a really nice payoff. Inga Rune Eyes works well in blue-black because it synergizes incredibly well with removal spells. If you trade off Inga with another creature and then kill one of their creatures with the trigger on the stack, then you draw 3 cards and probably win that game. And then of course black gets access to some premium removal, and Poison the Cup is one of the best removal spells in the set. Moving on to green-white, this is another deck that just is going to play out as a typical aggro deck. Maja the Bretigard Protector is going to be good if you are playing a more go-wide themed deck, as will Battershield Warrior. And then a card like Fall of the Imposter is nice for just buffing up your small creatures. 2-drop into Fall of the Imposter means you're going to be hitting with a 3/3 on turn 3, and then you're going to be getting rid of your opponent's blockers. So green-white is another aggressive deck with go-wide synergies. Next is blue-red Wizards and Giants, mostly focused on Giants though. It uses cards like Agar the Freezing Flame and Glimpse the Cosmos to get some card advantage tied along with its spells. And then Crush the Weak is not necessarily say giant on the card, but it's really nice when you have giants, because as you would presume, most of the giants are pretty large, so you're going to be killing a lot of your opponent's creatures and not many of yours when you use a card like Crush the Weak. Overall, looks like a pretty powerful control deck in the format. Moving on to black-green, it is a elf mid-range deck using a card like Herald, King of Skemfar to get those extra elves, and Skemfar Shadow Sage to either gain yourself life to stabilize or drain your or make your opponent lose life until they are defeated in the game with Skemfar Shadow Sage if you have enough elves. And then it also just has rock solid cards like Binding the Old Gods, which is just a premium saga in the set, and one of the more and is a card that can very easily draw you into a black-green deck. Moving on to blue-white, this is the colors with the most foretell in them, and it uses the card Vega the Watcher quite well to constantly churn through your deck using your foretell spells if your Vega survives. Nico Defies Destiny can also help you survive your opponent's assaults if you have enough cards foretelled. So if you are building your deck with a lot of foretell, you're going to gain a lot of life and be able to help stabilize with Nico Defies Destiny. And then Saw It Coming is a nice little foretell card for your deck, because your opponent's less likely to see it coming if you have a lot of other cards foretelled in the exile zone. Next up is red-green. This is going to be a mid-range deck or just a slightly bigger creature deck, and sometimes it will have some nice snow or splashing themes. Svella Ice Shaper is really good when you are trying to play a more snow-based strategy, because it does make you a snow artifact every turn with the Icy Manalith production, and then gives you a nice mana sink as well. Arnie Slays the Troll is just a fantastic card as well. It gives you a really nice payoff for having bigger creatures, because you're going to be able to hopefully take out a smaller creature that your opponent has and then start building up your threats and even ramping a tiny bit along the way. And then finally, Blizzard Brawl is the sort of card that thrives in red-green already, because you are going to have bigger creatures naturally, and then also with the snow themes, you're going to have the ability to trigger the bonus effect on Blizzard Brawl, so another good red-green card. Moving on to black-white, this is a very unique and fun-looking archetype. It is a double spell-themed deck where you use cards like Furia, Judge of Valor, to Clarion Spirit, and Bloodsky Berserker to pay you off for casting 2 spells in a single turn. This is where Code Spell Cleric, that we looked at in the top white commons, fits in the best, because it also rewards you for casting it as the second spell, and it is a cheap spell to help facilitate this. So when you have a deck like this, you're going to want to prioritize the payoffs, like Furia, to help you continue digging through your deck, and then you're going to want to make sure that you have enough cheap cards and a little bit of card draw to make sure you don't run out of gas and can continue to churn through your deck and cast 2 spells in a turn. Furia is a real key part of that because she gives you extra card advantage when you are casting your second spell. Moving on to blue-green, this is a snow deck. And also there are a lot of changelings in blue-green, so if you do have some minor tribal synergies, sometimes those will find a home in blue-green, but typically it's going to just be a snow deck. You use cards like Boreal Outrider, Icebind Pillar, and the 3 Seasons to reward you for having a lot of snow lands and cards that care about snow. Moving on to black-red, this is a great aggressive deck. It's got some Berserker synergies, it's got some Boast synergies, and it's got some Sacrifice synergies, which overall is just going to lead to a very powerful curve-out deck. There's just a lot of powerful 2-drops and 3-drops in red-black, and its signpost uncommons of Carter Doomscourge and Carter's Vicious Return are both fantastic. So getting those cards are an easy way to pull you into a black-red deck, and also just having a good curve of black and red cards. There's some pretty good removal available in black and red, and overall it looks like a very powerful color combination. Moving on to some combat tricks you need to be aware of. There are less combat tricks this time around, probably because it would have been very difficult to both play around a ton of combat tricks and also have to worry about what cards your opponents are foretelling. So in the set in white, there are 3 combat tricks. One of the important things to note is that if your opponent only has a single white mana up, their creature's only able to get +1 power. In the case of Kaya's Onslaught, if they have a foretelled card, then they can get plus like a double strike as well. But if your opponent doesn't have a foretelled card, then +1 power is the most they can get if they only have a white mana up. But keep in mind that they can untap the creature. So Wings of the Cosmos, this is the sort of card that can really blow you out if you don't know it's coming. But if you think your opponent might have it, maybe not attacking with your important small utility creature is something you could do. And then Warhorn Blast is just the classic end the game out of nowhere card when you have a lot of tokens. In blue, Brine Barrow Intruder is the only card that I would consider a combat trick. It shrinks a creature temporarily and also adds a slight boost of power onto the board, so try not to walk into this effect when your opponent looks like they might have it. In black, the combat trick is Demonic Gifts, so that means that if your opponent has black mana in their deck and they're holding up 2 mana, then Demonic Gifts is possible, but if they have less than 2 mana, then they cannot have a black combat trick, which is really important to know. Red gets Run Amok, which is only useful when the creature is attacking, so one thing you're going to want to make sure you do against Run Amok is that if you're trying to kill a creature with damage-based removal, you do it before they declare attackers, or else they can buff up the creature and blow you out. And then finally, in green, it gets Mammoth Growth, which is a nice foretell combat trick that can really make a creature massive, and Snakeskin Veil, which putting a permanent counter on the creature is going to be really annoying, and also giving Hexproof makes it a little bit less likely to be targeted by removal. So those are the combat tricks you need to worry about in the set. Moving on to some trap cards, we're starting off with Dusk Wielder. This card is just too cheap, too small, and its boast ability doesn't do enough to justify its position in your deck, even if you are super aggressive. Open the Omen Paths is another trap card because it looks like it does a lot, but adding a bunch of mana to your mana pool doesn't really do much in Limited because you generally don't have a card that you really care about getting out 1 turn earlier, and giving creatures +1/+0 until end of turn is not worth a card. Next is Dogged Pursuit, which looks like a lot better than it is, and generally is not a card that you're going to want to be playing. It's just it lacks impact in a lot of matchups. It's not great for control decks, and even aggressive decks would rather be adding something else to the board that has a larger effect, because if you are an aggressive deck, only hitting your opponent for 1 damage a turn, even if it's hard to interact with, is just not going to cut it for 4 mana. And finally, Forging the Tyrite Sword is the sort of card that looks like it's going to be a lot better. Its artwork is absolutely gorgeous. It's a gold card, so these are the sorts of things that can make people think that the card is good. But when you really look at it, it's 3 mana to make a couple of treasures and then eventually tutor for a card if you have that sort of card in your deck. It obviously falls apart if you draw your equipment that you wanted to get before you end up being able to tutor for it. And overall, it's just the sort of narrow, slow card that you don't want in your red-white decks that are generally going to be aggressive. Moving on to some combos to be aware of in the set. The first one is an absolute classic between Pingers and Death Touch. If you have a Hagi mob or Hagi mob and you put a Rune of Mortality on it to give it Death Touch, or you somehow equip the Rune of Mortality to it, but if the rune is on an equipment, and then you use the Boast ability. Dealing that 1 damage will have Death Touch, so you'll be able to kill any creature you want, which is quite powerful. Moving on to another classic combo, Shackles of Treachery is a steal effect, Village Rites is a sacrifice effect. You use Shackles of Treachery to take your opponent's creature, attack them with it, and then post-combat you sacrifice it to Village Rites, and your opponent never gets that creature back because it's now dead. Moving on to the third combo, it is between Kaya's Onslaught and Provoke the Trolls. This is a nice little way to hit your opponent out of nowhere, because if you do use Kaya's Onslaught to give Double Strike, that really does pair well with other combat tricks, and Provoke the Trolls giving +5/+0 if your creature survives is really an incredible amount of damage. Just those two alone are going to add a lot. Even if you're using them on a 3/3 creature, which is the minimum sizing, use Kaya's Onslaught, make it a 4/4, Provoke the Trolls, make it a 9/1 Double Striker, and you hit your opponent for 18. And then the final combo is between Sculptor of Winter and Glittering Frost. It's a little bit less splashy than the 1-turn kill of Kaya's Onslaught and Provoke the Trolls, but being able to use your Sculptor of Winter to untap a land that you have enchanted with Glittering Frost allows you to generate an absurd amount of mana early in the game. If you curve out with it, turn 2 Sculptor, turn 3 Glittering Frost, then all of a sudden on turn 4, if you make your land drop, you have access to a whopping 7 mana, because you tap for 2, untap it, tap for another 2, that's 4, and then you have 3 other lands, so that is 7, which is really a lot of mana on turn 4 to have. Moving on to the fixing available in the set, there is a lot of fixing in green, and there is even some land fixing and a little bit of colorless fixing. Sulphurous Mire is a part of a cycle of 10 lands that are snow dual lands, so there is one for every single color pair in the set, and those are going to be really important for if you're trying to build a snow deck, or if you're trying to play get some mana fixing into colors that don't typically get it, like red white or black red, or colors that don't include green, basically. Shimmerdrift Veil is also going to be a key component of those snow decks. It's going to be allowing you to snow decks or fixing decks. It gives you, once again, colorless access to any color you want. So in the early game, if you need one of your main colors, you can use your Shimmerdrift Veil for that. But if you draw it after you already have your 2 main colors, you can name your splash color and use your Shimmerdrift Veil that way. So it's a lot of flexibility, and it's a snowland to boot. The final piece of colorless fixing in the set is Replicating Ring. This is the sort of card that is going to be very slow. The extra text about making other replicating rings is generally not going to be relevant. So if you really need a source of fixing, or you really care about snow, you'll play Replicating Ring, but generally it's got a pretty low powered card. In green, though, the fixing can be quite good. Spirit of the Alderguard is very good fixing if you do have a snow land of the color you want to fix for, because you can then have a 4-mana creature that is potentially a 3/4 or even a 4/4 or something of that nature that also fixes your mana, which is really nice. Glittering Frost we already talked about a little bit, but it's also a great way to tap and fix your mana, and it is especially good if you're trying to splash multiple colors, because it can tap for any an additional mana of any color. Path to the World Tree can be really nice if you're going deep on fixing, though generally I would not advise playing it unless you have some chance of activating the extra ability on the card, because otherwise it's a bit inefficient. But if you do have a few Glittering Frosts in your deck and a couple of snow duels that tap for those colors, Path to the World Tree can be a fine fixing as well. And finally, Horizon Seeker is also fixing. It's a little bit less reliable, because if your opponent kills it before you get to attack, you don't get to use the Boast ability. But if you are able to trigger the Boast ability, you can get a land, any basic land, and put it into your hand. So that means that you will be able to get your mana fixing in that way. Finally, some last tips on the format. I wanted to note that the utility lands are fantastic. There is a cycle of 10 lands: Axgard Armory, Bretagard Stronghold, Gates of Istfell, Notvold Slumbermound, Great Hall of Starnheim, Immersturm Skull Cairn, Lidiara Mirror Lake, Port of Carfil, Skemvar Elder Hall, and Surtland Frostpire. These are all quite good. They're better than they look. Even if the abilities look quite expensive, tacking that onto a land is like critical for those cards, because you just get to play a normal game of Limited, and then all of a sudden your land that the only downside was that it came into play tapped is all of a sudden winning you the game, even if it's just a minor effect. A lot of the time the cards are going to be like just getting you so much extra benefit that you are just defeating your opponents. So those are the sorts of things that it can be hard to evaluate, but these cards are absolutely fantastic if you are those colors. And then finally, when it comes to drafting a snow deck, you need to have a reason to draft the snow deck before you prioritize the snow lands. Some of the payoffs for snow are a little bit less powerful in this set, and so you want to make sure that you're not just wasting all of your picks on a snow land and then not getting any payoffs to support it, because that can really train wreck your draft. So make sure that you have at least one reason to care about snow lands before you start really prioritizing them. Obviously, if you're in color combinations that care more about snow, like blue-green that cares more about snow, you can take the lands more highly. But if you're playing something like a red-white deck that doesn't care enough about snow, then you don't really want to be taking the snow-covered plains over a good card for your deck. Whereas with other color combinations, when you already have a payoff, those snow lands all of a sudden become a higher priority. Drafting snow is going to be a real challenge in this set because of the balance between having to actually draft lands for your deck as well. You can still put normal basics in your deck, but you want to have as many snow lands as you can, but you also don't want to cost yourself too much power in the rest of your deck. So that's going to be a delicate balance, and it's going to be a lot easier to do if you already have a reason to draft snow before you start taking those lands super highly. That is going to do it for this draft guide for Kaldheim, though. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Remember that if you did, to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel to get all of my Kaldheim content, and also comment if you have any questions or feedback, and leave hashtag ready for Kaldheim in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video. That is going to do it for this Kaldheim draft guide. I really do hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.